Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray is not just a Gothic novel about a portrait that ages while its subject remains young. It is a brilliant exploration of aestheticism, morality, vanity, and the corrupting influence of beauty and pleasure. Published in 1890, this novel scandalized Victorian society with its frank discussion of hedonism and its apparent rejection of conventional morality, yet it has endured as one of the most quoted, adapted, and analyzed works of English literature. In today's video, we're diving deep into the decadent world of The Picture of Dorian Gray, exploring Oscar Wilde's fascinating and tragic life and how his philosophy of art for art's sake shaped this controversial masterpiece, analyzing the novel's themes of beauty, corruption, and the double life, examining its unforgettable characters and symbolic richness, and understanding why this tale of a man who sells his soul for eternal youth continues to resonate with readers more than 130 years after its publication. To understand The Picture of Dorian Gray, we must first understand Oscar Wilde himself, one of the most brilliant, witty, and ultimately tragic figures in English literary history. Born Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde in Dublin, Ireland, in 1854, Wilde came from an accomplished family. His father was a renowned surgeon, and his mother was a poet and nationalist who held literary salons. From an early age, Oscar displayed extraordinary intelligence and a gift for language. He excelled at Trinity College Dublin and later at Oxford University, where he became associated with the aesthetic movement, a philosophy that championed art for art's sake and the pursuit of beauty above all else. At Oxford, Wilde fell under the influence of Walter Pater, an art critic who argued that life should be lived as a work of art, that the pursuit of beautiful sensations and experiences was the highest calling. Pater's famous conclusion to his book The Renaissance urged readers to burn always with a hard, gem-like flame, to seek out passionate experiences and moments of intense beauty. This philosophy deeply influenced Wilde and became central to his worldview and his writing. Wilde also absorbed the ideas of aestheticism from the pre-Raphaelite artists and from the French symbolists, developing a philosophy that art should be created purely for beauty, not for moral instruction or social purpose. After Oxford, Wilde moved to London and set about making himself famous. He cultivated a distinctive persona, dressing flamboyantly, carrying flowers, making witty pronouncements, and positioning himself as the embodiment of aesthetic values. He became a celebrity, famous for being famous, and was satirized in Gilbert and Sullivan's comic opera Patience as a languid aesthete who worshipped beauty. In 1882, Wilde embarked on a lecture tour of America, famously declaring to customs officers that he had nothing to declare except his genius. His wit, charm, and provocative ideas made him a sought-after guest at society gatherings, and his epigrams and paradoxes became widely quoted. In 1884, Wilde married Constance Lloyd, and they had 2 sons. For several years, Wilde appeared to live a conventional Victorian life, working as an editor and writing fairy tales for children. But beneath this respectable surface, Wilde was leading a double life. He was having sexual relationships with young men, a fact he kept carefully hidden because homosexuality was illegal in Victorian England and could result in imprisonment and social ruin. This double life, the contrast between public respectability and private transgression, between the mask one shows society and one's true desires, would become a central theme in The Picture of Dorian Gray. By the late 1880s, Wilde was at the height of his literary powers. He published a collection of fairy tales, The Happy Prince, and other tales that demonstrated his ability to combine beauty with moral depth. He wrote brilliant critical essays defending his aesthetic philosophy and arguing that art should be judged purely by aesthetic criteria, not moral ones. And in 1890, he published The Picture of Dorian Gray, first as a magazine serial and later, after revisions in response to harsh criticism, as a novel. The book was shocking to Victorian readers, who saw in it a celebration of immorality and decadence, though Wilde insisted in his preface that books were neither moral nor immoral, only well or badly written. The novel tells the story of Dorian Gray, a beautiful young man in London who has his portrait painted by the artist Basil Hallward. Basil is obsessed with Dorian's beauty, believing that Dorian represents a new ideal of perfection. While sitting for the portrait, Dorian meets Lord Henry Wotton, a cynical aristocrat who delights in paradoxes and shocking statements. Lord Henry tells Dorian that beauty and youth are the only things worth having, that he should dedicate his life to the pursuit of pleasure and new sensations, and that morality is simply a creation of society designed to suppress natural desires. Lord Henry's philosophy is essentially Wilde's aesthetic philosophy taken to an extreme and stripped of any moral constraints. Under Lord Henry's influence, Dorian begins to understand the value of his own beauty and youth. When he sees his finished portrait, he makes a fateful wish, declaring that he would give his soul if the portrait could age instead of him, if he could remain forever young while the painting bore the burden of age and sin. This wish is somehow granted, though the novel never explains the supernatural mechanism. From that moment, Dorian does not age, while the portrait, locked away in a room, begins to change, reflecting not just age, but the moral corruption of Dorian's soul. The first test of this bargain comes through Dorian's relationship with Sybil Vane, a young actress who performs in a shabby theater in a poor part of London. Dorian falls in love with Sybil, or rather with her ability to embody Shakespeare's heroines on stage. He becomes engaged to her, but Lord Henry's influence has already begun to corrupt him. When Sybil tells Dorian that she no longer wants to act because real love has shown her that all her stage performances were false, Dorian is disgusted. He realizes he loved her art, not her as a person, and he cruelly breaks off the engagement, telling her that without her ability to act, she is nothing to him. Sybil, devastated, kills herself that same night. When Dorian returns home after rejecting Sybil, he notices that the portrait has changed. There is a cruel sneer on the painted lips that was not there before. This is the moment when Dorian realizes that the portrait will indeed reflect his sins while he remains beautiful. His first instinct is horror and a desire to apologize to Sybil and make amends. But Lord Henry talks him out of it, convincing him to see Sybil's death as a romantic tragedy, a work of art rather than a real human catastrophe. This moment represents Dorian's moral choice. He decides to embrace the path Lord Henry has shown him, to live for pleasure and beauty without regard for conventional morality or the suffering of others. He locks the portrait away where no one can see it and embarks on a life of increasingly corrupt pursuits. The novel then jumps forward many years. Dorian remains young and beautiful at age 38, while his reputation grows darker. Wilde is deliberately vague about what exactly Dorian does, but we understand that he pursues every form of sensual pleasure, that he corrupts other young men who fall under his influence, that he experiments with drugs and forbidden experiences. High society whispers about him, questions why young men who befriend him often come to bad ends, why he seems never to age. But Dorian's beautiful appearance allows him to maintain his social position. People cannot quite believe that someone so beautiful could be truly evil. The portrait, meanwhile, grows increasingly hideous. It ages rapidly and takes on a look of cunning and cruelty. The changes in the portrait represent the state of Dorian's soul, showing the corruption that his beautiful exterior conceals. The portrait becomes Dorian's conscience, the visible representation of sins that society cannot see. Dorian is both fascinated and horrified by the portrait, visiting it in secret, studying the changes, seeing in it the true cost of his way of life. The novel's climax begins when Basil Hallward, who has not seen Dorian in years, confronts him about the terrible rumors surrounding him. Basil wants to believe the rumors are false, cannot reconcile them with Dorian's beautiful appearance. In a moment of pride, or perhaps a twisted desire to confess, Dorian shows Basil the portrait. Basil is horrified, recognizing his own work, but seeing it transformed into something monstrous. He begs Dorian to pray, to repent, to seek redemption, but Dorian, overwhelmed by rage at Basil for creating the portrait in the first place, For being a witness to his corruption, murders him, stabbing him repeatedly. He then blackmails an old friend, Alan Campbell, into using his knowledge of chemistry to destroy Basil's body. After the murder, Dorian tries to continue his life as before, but he is increasingly haunted by guilt and paranoia. He is tormented by visions of Basil's corpse and by fear that his crime will be discovered. He also encounters James Vane, Sybil's brother, who has spent years searching for the man who destroyed his sister. James nearly kills Dorian, but is fooled by Dorian's youthful appearance. Believing that someone who looks so young cannot be the man who ruined his sister 18 years earlier. However, James is later accidentally killed during a hunting party at Dorian's country estate, removing this threat, but adding another death to Dorian's conscience. The novel's ending is swift and dramatic. Dorian, tired of the portrait and what it represents, decides that he will destroy it. He believes that destroying the portrait will free him from his past, will allow him to start fresh. He takes the knife he used to kill Basil and plunges it into the canvas. Servants hear a cry and a crash. When they break into the locked room, they find the portrait restored to its original beauty, showing Dorian as a beautiful young man. On the floor lies a corpse, withered, wrinkled, and hideous, with a knife in its heart. Only the rings on the fingers allow them to identify the body as Dorian Gray. In destroying the portrait, Dorian has somehow destroyed himself, and all the age and corruption that the painting had borne have returned to him in an instant. At the heart of the Picture of Dorian Gray is an exploration of aestheticism and its moral implications. Lord Henry's philosophy, which Dorian adopts, holds that beauty and pleasure are the highest goods, that one should live for sensations and experiences without regard for conventional morality. This philosophy is tremendously seductive. Lord Henry's conversation is brilliant, witty, paradoxical, filled with observations that seem profound even when they're morally questionable. He argues that society's moral rules are arbitrary, designed to suppress natural desires and make people boring and uniform. He suggests that sin is simply a myth invented to control people, that what matters is living intensely and beautifully. But the novel shows the hollowness and danger of this philosophy when taken to its logical extreme. Dorian's pursuit of pleasure and beauty leads him to treat other people as objects for his amusement, to destroy lives without remorse, ultimately to murder. The portrait serves as a visual representation of the moral reality that Lord Henry's philosophy denies. Even if society cannot see the corruption, even if Dorian can maintain his beautiful appearance and social position, the corruption is real and grows worse with each sin. The novel suggests that there is a moral reality that exists independent of social convention or personal philosophy, that our actions have consequences for our souls, even if we can hide those consequences from others. The portrait itself is one of the great symbols in English literature. It represents multiple things simultaneously: Dorian's conscience, his true self hidden beneath a beautiful exterior, the inevitable consequences of sin, the relationship between appearance and reality, the way art can reveal truths that life conceals. The portrait ages as Dorian should age, but it also becomes morally corrupt, reflecting not just time, but sin. The changes in the portrait are specific and revealing. After Dorian rejects Sybil, a cruel sneer appears. After he murders Basil, blood appears on the painted hands. The portrait shows that Dorian's sins are literally written on his body, though only he can see this body. The theme of the double life runs throughout the novel. Dorian lives two existences: the public life where he is beautiful, charming, and accepted in high society, and the private life where he pursues corrupt pleasures and contemplates his hideous portrait. This doubling reflects Wilde's own experience of living publicly as a respectable married man while privately having relationships with men. It also reflects a broader Victorian phenomenon where rigid public morality coexisted with extensive private vice, where respectable society maintained strict codes of behavior while individuals secretly violated those codes. The novel can be read as a critique of Victorian hypocrisy, the way society judged people by appearances rather than reality, the way beautiful surfaces could conceal corrupt depths. Dorian is able to continue in society because he looks innocent and beautiful. His appearance serves as a kind of moral credential that allows him to escape suspicion. The novel suggests that Victorian society was complicit in corruption because it cared more about maintaining appearances than about confronting moral reality. The characters of Basil, Lord Henry, and Dorian form a triangle representing different approaches to art and life. Basil represents the romantic view that art should express authentic emotion and that beauty is connected to goodness. He paints Dorian because he sees in him an ideal of beauty that inspires genuine feeling. Basil's art is personal, emotional, connected to his own soul. When he sees what Dorian has become, he is horrified and begs him to repent, showing that for Basil, moral and aesthetic judgments are connected. Lord Henry represents the aesthetic view that art and life should be lived for beauty and pleasure alone, without moral constraints. He treats life as a work of art, but his art is cold, detached, experimental. He influences Dorian out of curiosity, to see what will happen, treating Dorian as a noun. Experiment in living aesthetically. Lord Henry is a talker, not a doer. He advocates for a life of pleasure and transgression, but does not actually live that way himself. He remains safely within social conventions while encouraging Dorian to violate them. He is protected by his cynicism and detachment, never committing fully to anything, never taking responsibility for the consequences of his influence. Dorian represents the attempt to live out Lord Henry's philosophy completely. He actually does what Lord Henry only talks about. He pursues pleasure without restraint, treats life as an aesthetic experience, refuses to accept moral limits. But unlike Lord Henry, who remains untouched by the philosophy he espouses, Dorian is destroyed by it. The novel suggests that Lord Henry's aestheticism is only sustainable as long as it remains purely theoretical, that actually living according to these principles leads to corruption and destruction. The character of Sybil Vane is crucial to the novel's moral structure. She represents innocence, genuine emotion, and the conflict between art and life. Sybil is a talented actress who can embody Shakespeare's heroines perfectly because she has never experienced real love. But when she falls in love with Dorian, she can no longer act convincingly because she now knows the difference between stage passion and real feeling. She chooses life over art, reality over performance. Dorian, by contrast, prefers her performances to her authentic self, loves her as Juliet and Ophelia, but not as Sybil. His rejection of her when she can no longer perform perfectly shows his inability to value real human emotion, his preference for aesthetic surfaces over authentic connection. Sybil's suicide is the first casualty of Dorian's aesthetic philosophy, and it should serve as a warning that his path leads to death and suffering. But Lord Henry persuades him to see her death as beautiful and tragic, rather than as a moral catastrophe for which he bears responsibility. This reframing of a human tragedy as an aesthetic experience is deeply disturbing and shows the moral emptiness at the heart of pure aestheticism. The novel's treatment of influence and corruption is psychologically acute. Lord Henry corrupts Dorian not through direct instruction, but through casual conversation, through witty epigrams and paradoxes that seem harmless in the moment, but that gradually reshape Dorian's entire worldview. He plants ideas that take root and grow. Lord Henry never tells Dorian to murder or to destroy lives. He simply provides a philosophical framework that makes such actions seem justified, or at least amoral. This is a realistic portrait of how corruption works, not through dramatic moments of choosing evil, but through gradual shifts in perspective that make previously unthinkable actions seem acceptable. The supernatural element of the portrait aging while Dorian remains young is handled ambiguously by Wilde. The novel never explains how this works or why Dorian's wish is granted. Is there a literal devil or supernatural force at work? Or is the aging portrait a psychological projection, a manifestation of Dorian's guilty conscience that he perceives as real. Wilde deliberately leaves this unclear, and the ambiguity adds to the novel's power. What matters is not the mechanism, but what it represents, the gap between appearance and reality, the persistence of moral consequences even when hidden from others. The novel's style is distinctively Wildean, filled with epigrams, paradoxes, and beautifully crafted sentences. Lord Henry's conversation is particularly brilliant, consisting of witty reversals of conventional wisdom. He says things like, "The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it, and I can resist everything except temptation, and it is better to be beautiful than to be good, but it is better to be good than to be ugly." These paradoxes are entertaining and often contain genuine insights, but they also reveal a fundamentally cynical and amoral worldview. Wilde's ability to make Lord Henry so charming and witty is part of the novel's power and danger. We are seduced by his conversation even as we recognize its moral bankruptcy. When The Picture of Dorian Gray was first published, the critical response was largely negative and morally outraged. Critics accused Wilde of writing an immoral book that celebrated vice and corruption. Some reviews were viciously homophobic, detecting in the novel hints of homosexual desire, particularly in Basil's obsession with Dorian's beauty. These criticisms hurt Wilde, and in response he wrote a preface to the book edition that defended his aesthetic philosophy. The preface contains some of Wilde's most famous aphorisms about art. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. And all art is quite useless. And it is the spectator, and not life, that art really mirrors. But the preface is somewhat disingenuous because the novel itself is deeply concerned with morality, even if it approaches moral questions from an aesthetic perspective. The novel shows the consequences of Dorian's choices, portrays his corruption as tragic and destructive, and ends with his death as a kind of moral punishment. While Wilde claimed that art should be amoral, his novel actually explores moral questions in profound ways. Perhaps Wilde's point was not that morality doesn't exist, but that art should approach morality indirectly, through beauty and symbol rather than through didactic instruction. The trial and fall of Oscar Wilde, which occurred just 5 years after the publication of Dorian Gray, added tragic resonance to the novel. In 1895, Wilde was involved in a disastrous libel suit against the Marquess of Queensberry, the father of Wilde's lover, Lord Alfred Douglas. Queensberry had publicly accused Wilde of homosexuality, and Wilde, encouraged by Douglas, sued for libel. The trial went catastrophically wrong. Evidence of Wilde's relationships with young men was introduced, and Wilde lost the libel case. He was then arrested and tried for gross indecency, a charge covering homosexual acts. During the trial, The Picture of Dorian Gray was used as evidence of Wilde's corrupting influence. Passages from the novel were read in court as proof of Wilde's immoral character. Wilde was convicted and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. The experience destroyed him. Prison broke his health and his spirit. After his release in 1897, Wilde left England for France, where he lived in poverty and obscurity under an assumed name. He died in Paris in 1900 at the age of just 46, alone and forgotten except by a few loyal friends. The brilliant wit who had dazzled London society died in exile and disgrace. This tragic fall from fame to ruin, from celebration to condemnation, eerily mirrors Dorian Gray's story, giving the novel an autobiographical resonance that Wilde could not have fully anticipated when he wrote it. The Picture of Dorian Gray has had an enormous cultural impact. The image of the portrait that ages while its subject remains young has become iconic, referenced and parodied countless times in literature, film, and popular culture. The story has been adapted numerous times, from early silent films to modern versions that update the story to contemporary settings. Each adaptation tends to emphasize different aspects of the story. Some focus on the horror elements, some on the moral parable, some on the homoerotic subtext that runs through the original. The novel is often read as an early gay text, one that could not explicitly discuss homosexuality because of legal and social prohibitions, but that encodes queer desire in its depictions of male beauty and intense male relationships. Basil's obsession with Dorian, Dorian's corruption of other young men, the emphasis on forbidden pleasures that cannot be named, all these elements have been read as coded references to homosexuality. For many gay readers, particularly in earlier eras when explicit gay literature was unavailable, the Picture of Dorian Gray was an important text that spoke to their experience of having to hide their true selves and maintain a respectable appearance while living differently in private. The novel continues to resonate with contemporary readers because its themes remain relevant. The conflict between appearance and reality, between the face we show the world and our true selves, is universal. The question of whether we can separate aesthetic appreciation from moral judgment is still debated. The dangers of vanity, of valuing physical appearance above all else, of pursuing pleasure without restraint, these are perennial human temptations. In an age of social media where people carefully curate their images and present idealized versions of themselves while hiding their flaws and struggles, Dorian Gray's story feels more relevant than ever. The novel also speaks to questions about the relationship between art and morality that remain contentious. Can art be purely aesthetic, judged only by formal criteria, or must it engage with moral and social reality? Are artists responsible for how their work influences others? Can beauty be separated from goodness? These questions that Wilde grappled with in his preface and explored in his novel continue to provoke debate. Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray is a masterpiece because it combines a gripping, suspenseful plot with profound philosophical and moral inquiry. It creates in Dorian one of literature's great tragic figures, a beautiful man who destroys himself and others through vanity and the pursuit of pleasure. It examines the relationship between appearance and reality, between art and life, between aesthetic and moral values with brilliant wit and psychological insight. It shows the seductive power of beauty and the terrible cost of corruption. It is written in prose so beautiful and epigrammatic that passages remain quotable more than a century later. And it carries the added poignancy of reflecting its author's own tragic story, of a brilliant man destroyed by a society that could not accept him as he was. Thanks for watching this deep dive into Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. If you enjoyed this exploration of one of the most decadent and philosophically rich novels in English literature, don't forget to like and subscribe. Comment below with your thoughts on The Picture of Dorian Gray, your favorite Oscar Wilde quote, or which classic work you'd like me to explore next. Until next time, keep reading, keep questioning, and keep exploring the works of literature that challenge us to think deeply about beauty, morality, and the choices we make.